So good morning, everyone. Welcome to one of our 11 a.m. sessions for day 2 of the GALILEO Annual Conference. Today we have with us several folks. Chandler Christoffel, who is he may be the only, or he probably is the only user experience librarian at UGA Libraries. We also have Emily Luken. She is a librarian for art, classics, philosophy, and religion, also at UGA Libraries. And then we have Nan McMurry. She is Director of Collection Development as well at UGA Libraries. So thank you all for joining us this morning to give us this presentation. I'll let you all take it away.
Great, thank you, Joy. So yeah, we're going to be talking about a purchase request link that we implemented. As Joy alluded to, I'm a user experience librarian, and yeah, we only have one so far at UGA Libraries, and it's a relatively new role. It started right before COVID, and one of the things that I think is really neat about this project is that I had lots of ideas about what I might be working on, but I wasn't necessarily thinking of something like this. So this is a really interesting and surprising collaboration that gets at the nexus of usability, user experience, but also collection development. And so part of what's interesting is not only the sort of the technical aspects of this and the implementation and collection development implications, but also the collaborative implications for this kind of project. Because it was not just UX and collection development, it also involved research and instruction, ILSM, our systems and catalog, access services. So kind of a neat project that we're really proud of, and I'm excited to kind of share with you our experience so far. Nana's going to go ahead and start us off with a little bit of context about why we did this, and then I'll go ahead and explain a little bit more about what it is we're talking about when we say a purchase link request.
Yeah, thank you. Okay, so the quick answer as to why we did this would be because it seemed like a good idea, but we wanted to tell you a little more about the background because it does fit into the changing nature, the changing landscape of collection development in our library, and also some of the effects of the pandemic. So we wanted to be able to set it in context like that and give you kind of a before and after. So in the before times, pre-pandemic, we were a heavily print-based collection at our library. We were starting to collect more ebooks, but really ebooks were still kind of the exception and print books were the rule. And our basic collection development philosophy was what's sometimes referred to as a just-in-case process, meaning that we have librarians who have subject expertise. We try to anticipate user needs and get a lot of really good material on hand before they even know they need it. So it's that kind of build it and they will come sort of philosophy. It's mostly librarian driven. And that traditional way of doing collection development has two major weaknesses. One is that it is increasingly unsustainable from a financial standpoint. So even though we feel like we have a generous budget for books, every year that budget has been flat for a number of years. And every year the universe of things that we could acquire continues to expand. So every year we're only able to buy a shrinking piece of that book pie, if you will. And the other disadvantage is that that philosophy of we'll build it and they will come doesn't always turn out in practice. Sometimes we misanticipate people's needs, if that's a word. And so to some extent, our collection is underused and some things don't get used at all. So we were beginning already to turn more towards various user-driven approaches to collection development. And you all have probably heard of these evidence-based acquisitions or patron-driven acquisitions. And we know we could talk about that more at the end if anybody has questions, but we were still just kind of dipping our toes in those waters at that point. And then the third thing is that although we did have this librarian-driven approach to collection development, we believed that we were also very welcoming of user requests because we knew we couldn't anticipate every need, and we wanted to have a way for our users or patrons to suggest things to us. And so what we had two approaches. One was that they could contact their subject librarian and ask for something, Or they could use a form we had on our webpage, and you can see a screenshot of that form on the right-hand side of this screen. It's a very typical standard form with where you fill in the author and the title and that kind of information, and then you fill in information about yourself at the bottom. And then that comes to Emily and me, and we would evaluate it and order it. And the only problem here, the reason it says in theory, is because once things started to change with the pandemic, we became aware that this very welcoming attitude that we thought we had wasn't working out quite so well in practice, and that we needed something more. So, and I'll explain that when on the next slide. So, yeah. Okay, then cue the pandemic. It didn't exactly set us on a completely new path to collection development, because that was a path we were already beginning to explore. But what it did do is greatly accelerate our movement down that path, or as the slide said, gave us a big kick in the pants. So what happened during the pandemic is that we became aware of just what a disadvantage it was under those conditions to have a heavily print collection. Because for about 2.5 months last year, about this time last year, our library was closed, our facilities were closed to both the public and to our own library staff. So we could work from home, but there was no way we could work on print books. So that means not just that our users couldn't come to our buildings and check out print books, but that also we couldn't order print books, we couldn't ship print books, they couldn't be shipped to us, we couldn't receive them or unpack them or process them or catalog them or shelve them. That entire pipeline of print materials was completely frozen for an extended period. And then even after we reopened to our staff, we had a big backlog, and we had to observe quarantine for the materials, multiple days of quarantine. We're a big library, and materials pass through a lot of different hands, and every time it passed through hands, it had to be quarantined. So further delays getting print material to our users. And then even when we reopened to the public and they could come back and check out books, not everybody wanted to do that in the middle of a pandemic. Many people were staying away from campus or limiting their trips, not wanting to come into communal spaces like libraries. So our print collection suddenly became much less useful to us than it had been in the past. And we realized we need to get more ebooks really fast. So we could not do that according to the traditional just-in-case method of collection development, because we couldn't duplicate our whole collection, our whole print collection as an ebook collection. Nobody has the money to do that. So we needed a more targeted approach to doing that, to getting the books that our users wanted. So that pushed us much more towards what's called a just-in-time collection. That is, it's much more user-driven rather than librarian-driven. And again, we invested much more heavily in those techniques like evidence-based or patron-driven. But we still found ourselves with that need for, well, what about individual requests that people might have? And that's when it became more and more evident that our form that you saw on the previous slide and the contacting your librarian, those are good methods in theory. We're still doing them, but they're not enough. And so, because what we were learning, there was a lot of traffic on our chat sites and interactions in reference points, indicating that people were really scrambling, both faculty and students, to convert their lives to an electronic life. And the methods we had for them to communicate for us were increasingly inadequate. So did people even know they could request books? Did they know they had a subject librarian? Did they know who that person was? Did they know how to get in touch? Did they know we have a form? Did they know where the form is? It's not really front and center on our webpage. So we needed something more that would really meet the users where and when they were in terms of point of need. So that's a long history of how this request link idea was born.
Great, thanks, Nan. That was a great sort of history leading up to sort of explaining what it actually is. So here's an example of where you might find this purchase request link. This is actually available in our catalog. We use Primo. So if you search for a book in Primo and you bring up the full record display and then you sign in, you will see multiple request options, the local request for pickup, borrow via interlibrary loan, and then ours appears third, depending on the situation and availability. And it says request for UGA Libraries to purchase ebook. So this is the most common situation where you might find our link. There's another situation less likely, but that might also occur. So let's say you're not in our catalog and you're an external database. So for example, EBSCO Discovery Service, EDS, or even Google Scholar, and you click on the little hidden get it at UGA option that might appear. And that's gonna serve as the link resolver. And it might take you to a services page for a book that we do own, which would look like the last page you saw. It might also take you to a services page for which we don't own anything. And our link also occurs there. So you can see this is a bit of a sparser record because we don't own it. And it sits right below the borrow via interlibrary loan link. And it actually has a very similar mechanism. In Primo is called a general electronic service. And it's similar in that not only does it appear on this page, but it also, in a really nifty kind of way, pulls bibliographic data from the URL. It pulls open URL data and then fills it into your form. And so the advantage here is that the user is that much further toward completing the form. Doesn't have to do all the arduous work of filling it out. And you can see that this is what auto-populated from that last record. It's a German text, so not everything came in, and that depends on the metadata coming. I think that came from Google Scholar, but everything that was required did come in, so the user could continue filling this out as needed. The form itself is a LibWizard form. So if you're not aware of that, it's a SpringShare product like LibGuides or LibApps. It's one of the lib apps. And the LibWizard form is great because it's very intuitive to set up. And another virtue of it is that it's set up to grab open URL data. So in terms of that tricky part of getting this to auto-populate, LibWizard was pretty much ready to go. I'm going to allude to this a little bit later. It isn't perfect. It's set up to grab open URL data, but not in a super sophisticated or advanced way. And as you can imagine with open URL data, it's often inconsistent and messy. And so there was some hacking that we had to do to make it work. But as far as a tool that you can more or less just start with and not have to build in-house or hunt for, LibWizard was a great application for what we were trying to do. So I want to talk about our process and the different project stages we went through. And so let's go back to June 2020. Our ILSM manager, Simon Hunt, and I were just trying to test out this link to see if it worked on the production side, as in like the side that users see, and also just make, because it's always a little bit different between test and production. So we tested it for an hour, not thinking anybody would notice. And in that 1 hour, we got 5 requests from 3 different users. So our first reaction was, yeah, there's demand for it and it works. And then immediately it was, uh-oh, is this going to be a problem? And as soon as we shared this information with Nan, she said, yeah, that's great, but that could be a flood. So we need to break this up into baby steps here. And so we did just that. Roughly 3 phases for this project. So phase 1, early, late summer, early fall, we limited to just books that we don't own. So I showed you that German book before. So that doesn't, the link, appears, but it's not a super common scenario. And so we knew it'd be manageable. We did that for several months, got our sea legs, and then phase 2, in November through January, again, books we don't own, but then we expanded that to include print books, things that are in the catalog, but only for 2016. It's kind of a different use case. Still a lot of print books from 2016, but not everything. And once we felt comfortable with that and collection development had a good workflow and didn't suspect that it would be an enormous deluge, we then moved to phase 3, which was, again, books we don't own, but then all print books we do own in the catalog. And we started that in February and have been doing that ever since. Threaded throughout these project stages, we also did usability testing. And so we did 2 rounds of usability testing with 10 users early on before we even launched our soft sort of phase 1 launch. The first usability test was kind of a preliminary test just to kind of get the protocol right and get a sense of what we wanted to ask, and looking at the analysis Round 2, another iteration of that with some tweaks with 6 users. And then we did a third round of usability right before we went to our phase 3 big launch with 10 users. So 20 users overall. I don't want to just go through all 3 usability methods because they're all very different, and because we're doing it iteratively and tweaking it depending on what we were really trying to ask about. But I will give you some common themes from our usability methods and some findings. So across all 3 methods, we had a prompt asking the user to walk through how they might try to obtain a book or read a book. And we presented them with a catalog record. And it was a think aloud sort of protocol where we're really trying to get the user to not only do the task, but talk aloud about what their thought process is, what they're seeing, what they're thinking about, what choices they're making and why. And as part of that, we either observed or intentionally asked about the following. And we didn't necessarily ask all 3 of these on all 3 tests, but probably at least on 2 of them, and maybe sometimes on 3. So, what options on the full display they initially noticed or engaged with. So you'll notice that our prompt was not how might you use this purchase request. It actually is the more sort of natural, authentic, just trying to read the book. And we are kind of observing how the purchase request link plays into that more natural task. Do they understand the difference between the purchase request and other request options like ILL or local pickups? I just want to show you a picture real quick. So here's that catalog record again, and you can see, once they sign in and see the request options, it isn't just a vacuum. There isn't just ours. There's 3 other ones. At the time, there was just 2 because we didn't have interlibrary loan in there. But we wanted to make sure that they understood the difference. We also really wanted to make sure that our link wasn't confusing them or dominating the other links, because it'd be unfortunate if they weren't using interlibrary loan because they saw our link first, when really interlibrary loan might be better for them or better for us too. And then what their expectations were around what would happen if they used the link, right? And so sometimes this was pre, sometimes this was post, sometimes this was both. It might be that we ask, hey, what would you expect to see if you clicked on that link? What would happen next? Sometimes it was after the fact. Now that you've clicked on that link and done the form, how did that align with your expectations? So this idea of managing expectations was really important for us. And some additional questions or observations were, what were some aspects of the form that were difficult to understand or even answer? Time to complete, the text for the link itself, and this goes back to managing expectations. How do we word it correctly? Do they have any suggestions for wording? We also wanted to get a sense of their likely future usage. Are they going to actually use this? And we asked a little bit about past usage, both to users and also to compare it with likely uses. And then finally, going back to expectations again, how long do they think it would take for the print or the ebook to arrive, right? Because this could also be a factor in likely usage and expectations. Okay, so those are the questions and things we're looking at in our across our 3 usability tests. I'm going to talk about some of our findings right now. So, the big question was, do users understand what the link does? And the answer was not at first, not at second. It took us some iterations to get this right. So at first, our link said request ebook access, and usability testing showed that users might think that this actually gives them a direct link to an ebook, right? So that's a bit of an overpromise. We changed that to request ebook purchase, and this had the opposite effect. Some users thought that this would actually just take them to Amazon and that they can purchase it themselves. So kind of an underwhelming service, just to be sent to Amazon and good luck. So we eventually settled for requests for UGA libraries to purchase ebook, and this tested well. The part of me that's a minimalist does not like how long it is, but we had to really kind of manage expectations here and be clear about what's going to be happening. Another question, can users differentiate our link from those other request options? So again, here's the request options on the right, and you can see how ours is just one of those, including USG. The answer is yes. Once we got the wording right, they did differentiate it. But there was some other sort of peripheral problems that made it hard to differentiate. So for one, the sign-in button is not intuitive. And another thing is that the local request probably needed to change. So I'm going to show you what that looks like. So on the left, you can see what our sign-in button looked like before. Big red horizontal banner, and it said, sign in for more options, log in for services. Pretty general and vague, not necessarily obvious that you need to sign in there to request anything, or that requesting is really an option. Also, that horizontal banner kind of blended in, almost looks like a design element. So we did, in addition to this usability testing that kind of clued us into this problem, we did some A/B testing and found out that it's probably best for us to actually switch to more of a call to action type button. So that's more of a traditional button on the right. And then we also changed our verbiage to be more sort of action oriented. So it's sign in / request options to make transparent what's going to happen, what might happen if you sign in. It's not always the case because it's not always a print record that appears here. And then, as I mentioned before, our local request had to be changed. So this now says request for pickup, but our local request, which means that somebody will pull it from the stacks or from the repository, put it on hold for you to pick up. It used to just say request, which made sense when there weren't multiple options here. But requests started to seem odd in general and vague compared to requests for UGA libraries to purchase. So users showed interest in distinguishing those. And they actually gave us great suggestions about clarifying that because as it turns out, a number of users don't even know that they can request for pickup. So just making that more specific was really helpful. The problem here, I just want to mention this, by the way, is that this isn't possible if somebody else has it checked out. So they can also recall it. So request for pickup might be a little bit misleading, but we've agreed for now, at least it's better than just request, especially in the context of our other links. So how did users experience the form? Generally pretty well. So some quotes, good form. My favorite is less painful than expected. So we always benefit from low expectations and pretty intuitive and straightforward. However, there were some changes that need to be made. And we learned this both from the usability testing and also just testing on our own. The form definitely needed to be wordsmithed, especially because there's some display logic. And we wanted to make sure that the users were aware of some of the complexities in the form, and I'll talk through that a little bit in the form design. Single sign-on, users kind of might have expected that instead of having to input their information manually, and then some open URL issues. So let's talk about the single sign-on. So UGA, we have a single sign-on. A lot of our services are part of this. So once you sign in this way, your information, your account is active in a lot of other services. So I think some were a little bit nonplussed to find that they had to enter their name and department and all that when they had already signed in to the library website in some form. Technically, this isn't possible yet. They have to manually enter that at this point, but totally understanding, as far as the user is concerned, why do they have to keep adding this information? And this might actually be a reason why some people don't complete the form, because that is an arduous part to have to go through. And then open URL. I don't want to get too in the weeds on this, but open URL parameters are not always consistent. And so if it's something that's coming from our catalog, that is consistent. But if it's coming from an external source via the link resolver, like multi-search has lots of different content providers, Google Scholar is kind of the Wild West, and they're not always consistent. So I've color coded these so you can compare them. So that yellow orange, that's one way to do author with initial and last name. And then in the second record, you just do full author. With the blue, you have title. There's also B title, which I think means book title. And then you can see the purple, there's date, which is most common, but there's also pub date. And user doesn't care about that, but we care about that because we have to sort of bring these all in alignment into our form. And again, as I mentioned, LibWizard is great, but it's not really meant to do all of this. So this took a lot of MacGyvering. I'm not sure, is that a modern allusion to say? But a lot of hacking behind the scenes to make this work, kind of kludgy. So on the left, you can see what it looks like on the admin side of LibWizard, all these different potential parameters that might work for book title, year, and author. But the display logic allows some to be suppressed and others to be preferred. So on the right, you see what the user sees. So they don't care about that. They just want a pretty simple experience. This is kind of like the duck that's calm on the top, and underneath it's frantically moving its little legs. And then finally, one thing that was really kind of cool about the usability is it helped us gauge demand and also understand a little bit more about all the different factors that might play into somebody using this kind of service. So yes, there was demand for it. However, there's a lot of different factors that play into this that are not straightforward. So one, format preference. Maybe they like ebooks, they like print. Maybe sometimes that's situational. I had one person say that they liked ebooks because they don't get fined for late fees. So that's not a reading experience. That's just, like, I don't want to get fines. COVID-19, of course, that's going to be a huge factor and still will be for a while in a sense. So early on, especially when we were not, doing borrowing, that obviously played a role, but also some people just didn't want to come to campus, couldn't come to campus for different reasons. And also there was a bit of a delay. Even once we started opening up again and allowing borrowing, the message wasn't quite out yet. And so some people had brought some perceptions there. Expected wait time. So this was big. Sometimes this is informed by UGA Libraries experience with print or ebooks, sometimes by past libraries, but there's some baggage there. Awareness of other options. So, there's interlibrary loan, there's USG, there's local request. They might not be familiar with that. They might, so that plays into it. And so some people might not understand those options and how long they take, like that interlibrary loan is quite fast and quite successful. And so they might prefer the purchase request. Somebody else who's familiar with interlibrary loan might defer to that. And then finally, I think this is just so interesting to me, is consideration of fit for library's collection. So some people, that was not even in their mental thought process, like whether it was a fit. They were like, you're willing to buy, I'll tell you what I want. And some were much more conservative about that. They said, I'm interested in this, but I don't necessarily think this would fit your collection and I'm not sure. Or they thought, I don't necessarily know if the book's great yet. And so this is still a little bit of a lark. Maybe it's helpful, maybe it's not. Maybe just in a pinch, if I couldn't get it through interlibrary loan or Amazon or something like that. So the reason I think this is interesting is to go back to what Nan was talking about with just-in-time user-driven collection development. If users are self-repressing for some reason, that's something that we need to kind of think about and reckon with in our promotion and outreach, that we really do want what you want, and that let us maybe take that risk of deciding that it's not helpful for the collection, because that's probably better to get what you want than just to kind of have to make a guess all the time. All right. And I'm also just going to talk a little bit about the form design. So the usability showed us some, the link text and a little bit about demand, but it also showed us how we might improve the form. So you can see there in gray, we have a note. So that's our caveat. We'll try our best. This might take some time. That's managing expectations. Below that, you see that we're asking how I intend to use this item. So this plays into our desire to balance, on the one hand, making this form usable, not asking way too many questions. And of course, that's part of the impetus of getting that auto-completed bibliographic data page. However, we also want to be able to ask some questions that will minimize lots of back and forth with the user. And so that often might be inevitable depending on the availability, but can we ask some of that at the outset? So for example, with intended use, if the user selects short-term use up to 30 days, we actually show them this page, or this comes up down right below it, which is a warning, they may not be available for your short-term deadline. We then tell them about Gil Express and interlibrary loan. And we have, in terms of usability, we actually add a speed bump here that they understand. So they actually have to click on that to get next. And that really makes sure that they are doing this knowing that we can't guarantee a purchase, or at least it can't be done in the timeline. And so we're managing expectations there. So this is where we ask for your user information. I mentioned this because this is where sequence really matters. We wouldn't want to have this first, because if they filled this all out only to find that because they're a short-term interest, they probably shouldn't even use this form at all. We wanted to have that first, and then once they feel like this is worth their while, then fill this out. We wouldn't want to have this last either, because it is, for some users, we suspect that they don't want to have to fill this part out, and that makes this service a little bit less user-friendly. So if it's second, they at least know that they're going to have to put this work in, and not at the end where they go, ah. So this is, again, kind of balancing the information we need, but also being transparent about how long this form is or what's involved in the form. And then, finally, this took the most wordsmithing, because we wanted to ask about their preference, whether they even had a preference, but we also wanted to anticipate issues where their preference was not going to be available. And so this is where display logic comes in. And our first version of this tested very poorly, and users were like, I don't really know what you're asking for. So usability tested benefited us being able to set this up. And once we got it, it was very clear what we were asking for. And so this allows for alternatives. Would you be willing to accept a hard copy if you prefer ebook or not? And that way collection development doesn't have to sort of do a lot of back and forth on plan Bs, plan Cs. All right, so I'm now going to hand over the mic to Emily to talk about some of our statistics and data.
Yes, thank you, Chandler. Yeah, so switching gears a bit and stepping back, we wanted to share some of the initial response from our patrons. And as Nan mentioned earlier, some of the key motivations for designing the service were to make the request process more easier and more discoverable, and also to facilitate ebook access during the period when our print materials were inaccessible. And we're still early into the data collecting for the work, but we wanted to share some of the results, especially highlighting this most recent third phase period when we fully opened up the request link service. So first, did requests increase? Yes, they did indeed. The request link generated more requests for materials by patrons, and we can see here in the slide that there's a gradual increase in those first two phases of the service, which was roughly about 27 weeks when patrons only encountered the request link in the catalog primo for items we don't own, plus the print books from 2016 that we do own. And then in February, when we opened up the service to titles we don't own, plus all print books we do own, the requests through the link more than quadrupled. So that was great news. Second, has adding the request link service helped to facilitate ebook access? As we see here in the slide, through the request link, ebooks are clearly the preferred format by a wide margin. This may seem obvious since the link steers patrons toward an ebook request, but we also include other format options in the request form since an ebook simply isn't always available for purchase. With our other patron request form on the library's website, requests for ebooks have definitely increased since the beginning of the pandemic, but users that come to the other request forms still ask for print books as much as they do ebooks. So there's some evidence that the two request options attract different kinds of users with somewhat different needs. And you may also be wondering what's been happening with our other patron request form, which, as we mentioned, still exists on the website and then continues to be used. So in the next two slides, we'll look at orders made based on requests coming through the request link and the patron request form. And this distinction between requests and orders is significant because not all requests that come in actually result in an order. There are times when a requested item is not available, or we may already have it. And there's just generally kind of a range of reasons why a request might not necessarily generate an order. So when we compare the number of orders generated through the form alongside orders made through the request link, we're seeing that request link orders during that third phase, which is currently still in effect, they now surpass the purchase request form orders. So this period when both services are running at full throttle appears to show that both request services are reaching our patrons, but that the convenient and more easily discoverable request link is a more accessible option for some of our patrons and may better lead to a serendipitous discovery of the service. And then by breaking out orders from both request services by patron status, we can begin to create a picture of who is preferring which service. So at this point, graduate students are our most enthusiastic requesters. They've embraced the request link service with gusto, as they do our other service. Our faculty have historically been the heaviest users of the request form, and it appears that they continue to favor the form, though they have also discovered the link and they're using it regularly. We've also observed that undergraduate use of the request link service really jumped during the third phase of the rollout, which suggests that they're finding the service more easily this way. Historically, undergraduates haven't been heavy users of the patron request form, so we're really happy to see that they're finding an easier way to ask for materials through the link. And then I'll just end by saying that the purchase request form, which I've already noted has historically been more popular with faculty and grad students, it continues to steadily attract both user groups. So far, it doesn't appear that one request service is way more heavily used than another or than the other. Both options for requesting materials will just simply remain in play for now, and time will tell whether one will eventually supersede the other or not, and both will kind of remain out there in our website. So Nan, I'll pass it on to you.
So despite all the usability testing and the very careful thought that Chandler put into designing the request link, whenever you implement a new service, there are going to be bumps in the road. And looking at the bumps can make you also look at the road itself. And so we're referring to these as reality checks, and we wanted to share them with you so you could see the whole picture the way we're seeing it. In the first one, there's a popular belief that anything that's ever been created in print is now available out in cyberspace, that anything you want can be found online. We knew that was a myth going into this, but even we were somewhat unpleasantly surprised at how often it proved to be the case that when somebody asked for an ebook, we could not get an ebook. That happened about a third of the time in the requests that we got. So it's a fairly major bump in the road. Just because many times an ebook has never been produced, or there is an ebook, but it's not the kind of ebook that can be sold to libraries. It's only available to individuals, like some of those textbook sites or Amazon books on your Kindle. Those are not always things that libraries can get. So that was a stumbling block that we ran into pretty often. And then what that did, the unavailability of ebooks in a lot of cases, sort of altered the role that Emily and I were playing in this process. We went into it thinking, well, we're collection development librarians, we order books, this will just be more ordering of books. And it was, but it also, in these situations where we couldn't get the book that the person wanted, turned us into more like what we were calling dispatchers, or sort of like switchboard operators, where then we don't want to leave that person high and dry. We want to try to explore alternatives with that person. And although the problem, no ebook available, that's a uniform problem, the responses that we could give were very complex and varied. So things like, okay, there's no ebook. Well, is the person willing to accept a print book? Do we have a print book? Is our print book checked out? Is the print book available through Gil Express or through interlibrary loan? Does the person just want a chapter or two, in which case maybe we could scan it? So there were a lot of different situations that arose as a result of an ebook not being available. And that has ended up actually consuming almost more of our time than just getting the straightforward requests. And if that sounds like, oh, poor us, we had to work hard, that's not really the point. The point is that it gave us a really close-up view of the kinds of struggles our users face when the straightforward path directly to a resource isn't there, and we have to consider alternatives. So that was, real eye-opening for us to experience that side by side with our users. And then we also learned that a lot of people would click on the request link, but then not follow it all the way through to producing a request. They would bail out somewhere along the way, which told us that maybe we don't have, when we're trying to think about this service and how we might improve it, maybe we don't have as full a picture as we would like to have, because although Chandler has analytics type statistics that indicate that this is happening, we don't really fully know why it's happening. Like, is somebody just clicking on the link and then saying, oh, wait, this isn't what I thought it was, and then clicking away? Well, maybe that's a communication issue, and we still haven't quite hit, how do we describe this service in a way that people will really understand what it is before they click? Or if they leave somewhere along the way, is it because we did communicate to them that Gil Express or interlibrary loan are good alternatives in certain situations, in which case bailing out is maybe a good thing? Or we also don't know, even when they do submit a request and it's one of those ebook unavailable situations, and we give them advice about about their alternatives, we don't know whether they follow that advice or not. We don't know whether they reach success in the end. So there's still some missing pieces to this puzzle, or missing parts of the picture that we believe we would like to investigate further as a way to help us improve the service. And then finally, so we have this new service, and again, Chandler worked really hard to try to design it so that we do ask questions along the way. And not only do we gather information for ourselves, but we may also be educating our users a little bit through the process of using the form. We introduce alternatives to them about what they could do. But nevertheless, this is kind of instead of the bumps of the road, it's the road itself. I think we still need to make progress on having a truly user-centric way of doing this, because we're still expecting our users really to be aware of all of the services we offer and to understand what those services are and what the differences are. And although, you saw those examples of trying to figure out, the request for pickup and the request for interlibrary loan, we've been working hard to make those distinctions clear, but I think they're still not entirely clear, and we may be expecting too much of our users. And then secondly, we really are, all of these services that we offer reflect the organization structure of our library, meaning that, these different activities like interlibrary loan versus Gil Express versus purchase an ebook take place in different departments of the library. And they aren't really well coordinated. That's the role that Emily and I learned about, when we had to be dispatchers, is that it's like each of these services exists in its own little corridor. And if the user goes down that corridor and the service they find at the end is not exactly what they wanted, or maybe not the best choice, it isn't easy to jump to something else. And so what we'd really like to have is a fully coordinated array of services where, whether that would be by smart automated design or by excuse me, the kind of intervention that we've been doing, we don't know, but we feel like we're not at a destination yet. We're still on that journey. So we're still seeking that holy grail, which would be that wonderfully coordinated service that gets users where they need to go and doesn't expect them to understand what happens behind the scenes. And I think we're expecting a little too much of that still right now. So that, that holy grail, just like the true holy grail, it's much easier for us to envision that than it is to actually achieve it. And so that's still a work in progress. So, and then finally, so we don't leave you with too much focus on the bumps in the road, we wanted to say that this service has been extremely well received, not just in terms of people using it, but people appreciating it. So when we order the book, we'll say, contact the user and say, we're ordering the book that you asked for. Or when it becomes available online, here it is, here's the link, we're ready. That could just be coming from some robot. It happens to be coming as a personal email from Emily and me, but the users really, really appreciate that. We get a lot of unsolicited praise back. Thank you so much. And you can see some examples of it here. This is just a small sample. People often respond to that email and express their gratitude. So, we're really glad that we're able to offer this service now, and that people are taking us up on it so often. And as Chandler said earlier, I just wanted to mention that although you're seeing the three of us in this presentation today, there was a whole team behind this. We had a lot of support from our ILS department to get this designed. We had great help from our acquisitions department we had this big ramp up in the number of books we were purchasing because of this request. And so that, it was kind of a village effort here at our library. And I think that's it, right? Are we ready for questions?
All right, so we do have one question in the chat. What happens if a student says they need it as a required text for a class?
Okay. Yeah, it's complicated. Yeah, very complicated. So there's a belief about our library, I don't know where it came from, that we never buy textbooks. We do buy textbooks from time to time. And we just and different libraries respond to this in different ways. This is just kind of where we happen to be. We don't make a systematic effort to acquire every textbook that might be used in every class every year, but we do buy textbooks under certain circumstances. So if a student needs a required text for a class, if we can get it as an unlimited DRM-free ebook, that's great. We're happy to buy it. If it's only a one-user ebook, we may talk to the professor, or we may talk it out with the student a little bit. We're still going to incline towards buying it, thinking that some e-access is better than none. But it is kind of a problem area, because if you just buy a one-user ebook and 25 people are all trying to get it, that can create a problem. But still, more access is better than less, we think.
All right, when you send a personal email to a user, do you go through the Alma email user option or your UGA email?
It's actually a little bit of both. When the request comes in, we respond to it to say, yes, we're ordering it, or gee, we're really sorry, there's no ebook. We get that, we respond to the request itself. And then when the book becomes available, it's complicated and has to do with the interactions between our collection development and our acquisitions. And so our acquisitions person will often use that Alma email to let us know that the book's available. And then we usually forward that link with just a little more contextual information to the person who asked for it. And there's probably a more efficient way we could be doing that, but that's kind of where we are right now. So we send them a link. We send the patron a link to the record in our catalog rather than a direct link to the book. So that way they can always get back to it and find it in the catalog.
Thank you, Nan, for that answer. I'm trying to see if we have any more additional questions. We have a little bit more time here. If you all have questions, just type them into the chat or raise your hand. Okay. Well, I think that probably does it. You all did cover quite a bit of material in your presentation, and I know that folks appreciate the detail that you went into to explain, why you did this and then how you were able to implement it, and then even just getting the feedback from users that this was very, very helpful for them. So thank you so much. Thank you to Chandler. Thank you to Nan, and thank you to Emily for this presentation. And thank you to everyone else for joining us. As we mentioned earlier, their slides will be available on the Sched platform, and then the recording will be available later as well. Thank you all for joining us. All right, have a good one. Bye.
All right, thank you.